Hey, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the topic of canonicity in our continuing study of New Testament backgrounds. Christianity was a text-based religion. That meant that it had a group of written texts that were there as the foundation for it. Most pagan religions were practice-based. That means their teachings didn't matter. What they said didn't matter. What mattered is what you did. You offered the sacrifices. You offered the prayers. Belief was not considered to be an important part, and therefore texts were not really all that important. But Judaism and Christianity, upon which Judaism was Christianity that came and saw Judaism as its foundation, they were the exception. So Christianity was built upon Judaism's text-based faith. Now, the definition of canonicity is the process by which the books of the Bible were gathered and collected so that they came to be regarded as the standard and norm for Christians. The word canon actually means a rule, just like you might use a ruler to measure something. And what's interesting about that term canon, you say, well, what language was that in? Was that in Greek or was that in Hebrew? And the answer is yes, it was actually in both. Now, Greek and Hebrew are totally different languages. They have almost nothing in common, but this one word they do have in common, canon. A canon was a ruler, a standard of measure, and this term was used to describe the standard of measure of the books that were going to be the basis of faith. So canonicity refers to the church's recognition of the authority of the inspired writings. Now, that's different from canonicity doesn't make the book inspired. It recognizes that the book is inspired. What makes the book inspired? I'd say the Holy Spirit makes the book inspired. But the church, both in the past and in the present, has had to catch up with what the Spirit was doing and has had to determine which books were those that were inspired. And that study is known as canonicity. Josephus talks about the books of the Old Testament, what they call the Hebrew Scriptures, when he is writing to Appian. Appian was somebody who'd said some nasty things about the Jewish people. And Josephus, in response, says, we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another as the Greeks have, but only 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. He's speaking of the books of what we call the Old Testament. Of course, when he says 22 books, it's talking about the same books that we think of as the 39 books of the Old Testament, but they counted them differently. For example, they looked at the minor prophets, and they counted that as one book. And things like 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, those were each considered one book. Goes on to say, it's true our history has been written since Artaxerxes very particularly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time. So notice he's talking about the Apocrypha. We talk about that in a different lecture. He's talking about the Apocrypha. Those other books were not considered to have the same authority because they had not been written by the prophets. There hadn't been a regular line of prophets leading up to that period. But what we call the Old Testament, the Holy Scriptures, had been given via the prophets. And that means that the church was born with a completed canon in her hands, the canon of what we call the Old Testament. This brings us now to the New Testament canon, the New Testament books. How did these come to be recognized? Now, before we look into this, we must note that the existence of the canon does not equal the recognition of the canon. They are two separate issues. You have the existence of the canon, which would have been as soon as it was written, the Holy Spirit having inspired and superimposed, but it took a while for the church to recognize all of those books. Most of them were recognized almost immediately. And of course, remember, to be recognized, there had to be copies that were made. They had to be distributed. They didn't have the internet where they could do this immediately. It took time. And so there was going to be a process that was involved. Now, our earliest list is known as the Muratorian Canon. It's our oldest copy dates to the 7th century, but it's a copy of something that was originally written in the latter part of the 2nd century, that is in the 100s after Christ. And it's a listing, it's a partial list. It starts with Luke, but as it begins with Luke, it actually says, and the third gospel is Luke, and then it goes on to describe Luke and John, which means there's a page missing. And the page refers to the first 2 gospels. So it's a partial list because you know how sometimes you get a really old book and either the first or last page might get a little loose and fall out, and that's what took place with the Muratorian Canon. Now it includes the Gospels. Like I said, it starts with Luke, but it bears internal witness that there's others books of the Gospels, and it also includes the epistles of Paul and the epistles of John and Jude. But it also includes a book of wisdom written by friends of Solomon in his honor, and it mentions the Shepherd of Hermes. Now that's a later book, but it also says this later. It says it's written more recently, therefore it might not have quite the same authority. It mentions the Apocalypse of John, that is, what we call the book of Revelation. It also mentions an Apocalypse of Peter, but it says that latter one isn't received by everybody. In fact, today it's not received by anyone that I know. And so notice I'm quoting from it. It says, the blessed apostle Paul himself followed the order of his predecessor John and wrote only 7 churches by name. They are in this order, and then he gives Corinthians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Galatians, Thessalonians, and Romans. A little bit of a different order than are in some of our Bibles, and that's okay. He goes on to say, besides these, there is one to Philemon, and one to Titus, and 2 to Timothy. Notice the Muratorian Canon mentions all of the epistles of Paul. It says there's those ones that are written to specific churches, and then there are these personal letters in affection and love, but nevertheless regarded as holy in the Catholic Church. Now remember, when they say Catholic Church, they're not talking Roman Catholic. They're not speaking of something that is a denominational issue, but the word Catholic just means the everybody church, the universal church. And these are regarded as holy in the Catholic Church in the ordering of churchly discipline. There is also circulated one to the Laodiceans and another to the Alexandrians, forged under the name of Paul. Notice these are forgeries. These are not proper books in regard to the heresy of Marcion. And there are several others which cannot be received by the church, for it is not suitable that gall be mixed with honey. In other words, there were some other writings by this time that were floating around, but were considered not just neutral, but bad writings. They were considered spiritual poison. The Shepherd, and he's speaking now of a book known as the Shepherd of Hermes. The Shepherd, moreover, was written by Hermas quite recently in our time in the city of Rome, while his brother Bishop Pius sat in the chair of the church in the city of Rome. And therefore it too should certainly be read, but it cannot be read publicly to the people in the church, for it is neither among the prophets, whose number is complete to the end of time, nor among the apostles. And notice the criteria: it either came from the prophets, that's Old Testament, or it came from the apostles, that's New Testament. And here was a book, it was a good book, it should even be read, but did not have that apostolic authority. Now, some factors that brought about, that necessitated a need for a New Testament canon. First of all, there was the problem of heretics who were teaching some bad things and even bringing out some bad books, and so it was necessary to countermand those bad ideas by stating clearly, here are the books that are received, here are the books you're supposed to be reading. Marcion's canon, Marcion was a heretic of the 2nd century, and his listing of books comprised Luke. Of course, it was a carefully edited version of Luke that cut out the parts that Marcion didn't like, and 10 epistles of Paul minus the quotations from the Old Testament. Now, you take any epistle of Paul and you take out the parts of the Old Testament, you're going to have only a partial epistle, because Paul is always quoting the Old Testament. And so here was Marcion trying to present some edited versions of the New Testament to support his wrong views. And the church had to say, no, that's wrong, and here's why it's wrong. Secondly, the presence of other Christian writings. Not all other Christian writings were necessarily bad. There were some Christian writings that were okay. There was nothing wrong with them. They might be teaching or they might be telling stories of brave Christians. There were actually some of those going around. Nothing wrong with them, but they were not authoritative and were not supposed to be regarded as authoritative. So you have books like the Didache. The Didache just means the teachings. It was a sort of a manual for new Christians. You also have the epistles of Ignatius. He was one of the what's called one of the Apostolic Fathers. Doesn't mean he was an apostle, but means that he was the next generation after the apostles. And there were other church fathers too, who wrote letters and who wrote books, and they were good and they were worthy of being read. But they were not on the same level. And even Ignatius himself says, look, I'm not an apostle. I'm not on their level. You listen to what they have to say. And hopefully I'm representing that correctly. Irenaeus, now he's at the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century. He points to a canon that includes the Shepherd of Hermes. We already looked at that under the Muratorian Canon, but excludes Hebrews and 2nd Peter and Philemon and 2nd and 3rd John. Some of these books were, notice, left out of his list. A third factor necessitating a New Testament canon were the persecutions against the church and laws against ownership of the scripture. Here, if the Roman Empire said, you're not allowed to possess copies of the scripture, well, the question came up, were you willing to die for the Shepherd of Hermes as opposed to the epistles of Paul? In other words, which books were important to preserve? And the scriptures were important to preserve, perhaps not quite so much some of these other writings. Now, the criteria that was used for recognizing, remember, canonicity is all about recognizing which are the books that are inspired. The criteria for that recognition of the New Testament books, the number one criteria was apostolic authorship. Was the book written by an apostle or someone who had been deputized by an apostle? Now, there's certain cases, for example, the 4 Gospels were recognized by everybody early on. And yet you have Mark and Luke, neither one of those were apostles. But it was recognized that Luke was writing under the authority of Paul, and that Mark, it was assumed, early tradition states that he was writing under the authority of Peter. The second question, are they consistent? Are they working together, or are they at cross purposes? Now, it's interesting when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, especially compare John with the other 3 Gospels, sometimes the consistency issue is a little bit questionable. You say, for example, the cleansing in the temple, where Jesus goes with a whip and cleanses the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it happens very late in the ministry of Jesus, in his last week. In John, it happens at the beginning. But apparently that was not seen to be an issue. That was not, of course, you ask, well, what's the answer there? Did Jesus do it twice? And I think possibly. Or is it possible that sometimes events would be told, but not necessarily in chronological order? And that's possible as well. Thirdly, were the books received by the churches? And here sometimes it would be received by the church to whom the book was first addressed, but it might take time for them to make a hand copy or multiple hand copies and then gradually distribute these to the other churches. So this didn't happen immediately. This happened over a process of time. The church did not make certain books canonical. Remember, the church recognized certain books to be canonical. So the issue was the recognition by the church. Now let's look at that apostolic authorship. We have the testimony of Papias. He is one of the apostolic fathers. He's one of the next generation after the apostles. And he says, and actually it's Eusebius, a early church historian, who is quoting Papias. So Eusebius is living a couple of 100 years later. But he's quoting Papias, and he says that Matthew indeed composed a saying, that is the book of Matthew, in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them to the best of his ability. Now, we don't have the book of Matthew in Hebrew, so all we have are, if Eusebius is right, if Papias is right, then all we have is a translation. Of course, it's possible, I suppose, that even that Matthew himself translated. We don't know who did that. but we only have the Greek translation. Papias goes on, again, this is a quote through Eusebius. When Mark became the interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately whatever he remembered, though not in order of the words and deeds of the Lord. Notice Papias is saying that there were events that were written down, but not necessarily in chronological order. Sometimes they are a topical order instead, and that's fair and that's appropriate. We have the testimony of Ignatius. Now, Ignatius is an apostolic father, and we have copies of his letters. He says, "Not as Peter and Paul did, do I command you. They were apostles, and I'm a convict. They were free. I, even to the present time, am a slave. I'm much lower than them. I don't have the same authority that they have, and so they speak with authority. I'm speaking with a much lesser authority." So says Ignatius. In the next generation, Irenaeus, end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century, he says that Matthew also issued among the Hebrews a written gospel in their own language. He's echoing Papias, while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome and laying the foundation of the church. After their departure, I take that to mean after their death, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. So again, this testimony, probably coming via Papias, but who knows, that Mark is the one who, having received the information by Peter, now sets it into writing. Irenaeus goes on to say, Luke also, the companion of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who reclined at his bosom. Also, remember in the Gospel of John, there's this one that's called the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, Irenaeus tells us that that's John, the disciple of the Lord, who reclined at his bosom, also published a gospel while he was residing at Ephesus in Asia. And finally, Irenaeus says there's such certainty surrounding the Gospels that the heretics themselves bear witness to them. And starting from the Gospels, each one of them attempts to establish his own doctrine. The Ebionites, using only the Gospel of Matthew, they didn't want to read the other Gospels, are confuted by it when they make false suppositions against the Lord. They would use Matthew, trying to teach some false doctrines, and Matthew itself would overcome them. He goes on, Marcion, who mutilates the Gospel of Luke, is proved a blasphemer of the only existing God by those parts which are still retained. Even when he cut out the parts he didn't like, even the parts that remain still confounded him and still proved him to be in error. Those who follow Valentine, another false teacher, making copious use of the Gospel of John to illustrate their conjugation, will by that very gospel be proved to have and said nothing rightly. That is, these various false teachers would actually use the 4 Gospels that were there to try to make them say something they didn't say, and could be proven wrong even by those 4 Gospels. Tertullian. Now we're getting into the 3rd century, in the 200s. He says the same authority of the apostolic churches will defend the other gospels which we possess through them, and because of their using them, I mean the gospels of John and Matthew, while that issued by Mark may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was, and the digest by Luke, men are accustomed to ascribe to Paul. So here again, he's giving that same testimony of the apostolic authorship, recognized by the entire church. Now, Eusebius speaks of a collection. He says, among the disputed writings, the Greek term there, when he says the disputed writings, the antilegomenon, and that's just the writings that are against the word, which are nevertheless recognized by many, are extant the so-called Epistle of James, and that of Jude, and the second Epistle of Peter, and those that are called the 2nd and 3rd of John, whether they belong to the evangelist or to some other person of the same name. So notice there were some of the books that the church struggled with. Are these supposed to be part? We have no question about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts, the epistles of Paul, 1 Peter, but there's a few of these other, 1 John, but there's a few of these other books that we wonder about. And so these are the books that are going to be disputed or questioned. He goes on to say, among the rejected writings must be reckoned also the Acts of Paul. No, so he says there were the disputed writings, and then there were the ones there's no dispute. These are just not part of it. The Acts of Paul, the so-called shepherd, the shepherd of Hermes he's speaking of, and the Apocalypse, not the Apocalypse of John, but the Apocalypse of Peter. In addition to these, the extant epistle of Barnabas and the so-called teachings of the apostles. Teachings of apostles is probably the Didache. That, remember, I talked about a sort of a manual for early Christians. And besides, as I said, the Apocalypse of John, if it seemed proper, which some I say reject, but which others class with the accepted books. So with the book of Revelation, there were people that were wondering about it, but those other books he just mentioned, there was no question. Everybody agreed they're rejected. So what we've got those books, the homologomena, the books that are accepted by everybody, the four Gospels, Acts, the Epistles of Paul, 1 Peter, 1 John. And then there were a few books that people had questions about. Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. And as you look at that list, you begin to see perhaps why some of those were questioned. For example, Hebrews. Who wrote the book of Hebrews? We're not told. Whoever it was written to knew the author. It bears very obvious evidence that he's writing to people who know who he is, but we don't know who he is. James, why would you think that James might be questioned? Well, perhaps it was because there are places in James where you wonder, it sounds a little bit like he's contradicting something that Paul said when he talks about faith and works. Now, I don't think he is contradicting, and the early church eventually came to the conclusion, no, there's no contradiction. But still, for a time, they wrestled with it. 2 Peter is rather on the short side, and it says some harsh things. Also, 2 Peter and Jude actually say a number of things that were one is echoing the other. Jude, was he an apostle? Doesn't seem to be. And yet, was he associated with Jesus? Yes, the church eventually came to that conclusion. And then 2nd, 3rd John, and maybe Jude too, are very short epistles. And they wonder, do these really count? They're almost like postcards. Do they really count? And finally, the book of Revelation. I think there were those that scratched their heads and say, what on earth are all those visions? What do they mean? And so I think that was perhaps the reason for the struggle there in some of those. And maybe also because it had a rather low distribution at first. Now, we're getting to the 300s. 363, we have the Council of Laodicea. And at this council, they asked that only canonical books be read from the pulpit. That was probably already the general practice, but they wanted to make it the practice for everyone. We actually know of one situation. I think, if memory serves me right, it was Ignatius. Maybe not. Don't quote me on that. One of the early church or apostolic fathers who was asked about a certain writing said, "Sure, you can read that in the church," and then he went back and read it. He said, "Oh no, let's not do that. That's got some very bad things in it." So now they're asking that only canonical books be read from the pulpit, and it listed all the books of our New Testament, those that we talked about that were questioned, all of them except the book of Revelation. In the Easter letter of Athanasius, just a few years later, 367, he lists the 22 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the same ones that Josephus talked about, our Old Testament, same as our 39 books in our Old Testament, and he lists our 27 books of the New Testament, including the book of Revelation. And finally, we have, at the end of that century, the Synod of Hippo, Regius, 397. This was held at Carthage, and it recognized the New Testament, including Revelation this time, and it declared that nothing else should be read from the pulpit. So it had taken the church some time to wrestle with these issues, to wrestle with some of those books that were a little short or confusing or for whatever reason, but they had finally gotten everybody to come and agree. Now, our timeline on this. Notice we've got Paul and John. I probably could have put Matthew, Mark, Luke as well in that lineup, but I just couldn't fit them all on the page. And then Ignatius, who comes only a little bit later, living contemporary with those New Testament writers. And then Polycarp, one of the later Apostolic Fathers, one of the last of the Apostolic Fathers, Ignatius is already quoting bits and pieces from Matthew and from Paul's epistles. I don't know if he had a complete copy of the New Testament yet, because everything has to be handwritten and then delivered to the various churches. But he's quoting parts of it, at least, in his day. And it tells us how quickly that message is being spread, and that written word is being spread. We have the New Testament written. The earliest writing, I think perhaps, is the Epistle of James, but earliest writing around 45, maybe a little bit later, AD. And it's by I would say 95 AD, it is completely finished. Maybe quite a bit earlier than that, but at least by 95, 96 AD, the New Testament has been written. We have the Apostolic Fathers. They're the next generation, and they're already bearing testimony to a number of those books. They're quoting them. They're citing the apostles as their authority. We have people like Marcion, who, whether he wants to or not, he's giving credence to some of those books too, although he's trying to change those things. He's a heretic and teaching some bad theology. We have the Muratorian Canon that we cited toward the end of the 2nd century. That's, again, citing most of those books as being authoritative. They're struggling with a couple here and there. And we're going to have Constantine and the Council of Nicaea much, much later. This is 150 years later, before those come about. And yet, in a fictional book, now it's only fiction, and I have to remind everybody it's fiction, and when you're reading fiction, everything in there could be fiction, and in this case it is. Dan Brown writes a book called the DaVinci Code. It's a novel. It's rather well written. He likes to take themes and write them in sort of what if ideas. And in the book, he's got one of his experts saying that Constantine chose the books of the Bible and ordered other non-canonical books to be burned. Well, first of all, that had already been settled. Long before Constantine, almost all the books were already chosen, and there were a few that they were still questioning and struggling. Constantine had nothing to do with that. Neither did he order other non-canonical books to be burned, because we have lots of non-canonical books that were not burned and that were passed down to us. Secondly, the novel, and I have to underscore it is a novel, it is pretend, says the Gospels were edited after the Council of Nicaea. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was no editing that took place after the fact. Were there sometimes, as a scribe was copying something down, was there a typo? Well, certainly that happened in every manuscript. Had nothing to do with the Council of Nicaea before or after. And so that's why we talk about the issue of textual criticism and studying all those hundreds and actually thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament as we look for those typos that were made along the way. A third assertion that the novel says is that the Gnostic Gospels are older than the 4 canonical Gospels. Again, that's not just fiction, that's actually a lie. And he's trying to present something that's true, even in his fictionalized way of doing it, that simply has no basis in reality. The Gnostic Gospels all come consistently later than the 4 canonical Gospels. So don't get your theology from fiction. Get it from history. Get it from the truth.